From the Columbia University Language Resource Center, this is Said and Done, the podcast about languages and the people who speak them. This is Said and Done. I'm Chris Kaiser, and joining me is Skye Shannon Savage, a Ph.D. candidate in Columbia University's Department of Germanic Languages. In this conversation, we talk about Skye's journey from language learner to teacher of German, and we discuss a project that involved teaching a little bit of Yiddish in the German language classroom. We then speak about how language learning itself is a skill, and how that skill can be incorporated and taught in different ways. Here's my conversation with Skye Shannon Savage. Skye Shannon Savage, thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you being here.
Thank you for having me.
You're a PhD student in the German department at Columbia, and today we're going to talk about German, and we're going to talk about some projects that you've worked on. So why don't we get started by talking a little bit about your experience with German, how you first learned the language, and what you've been doing with that language study since you've been here at Columbia.
Yeah, so I don't have German family. I don't have actually any real strong personal connections to Germany. It really is kind of an accident that I come from a really small town where there really was not a lot of foreign language education. And I could have easily, frankly, gotten through my entirety of high school without ever learning another language or really being exposed. But foreign language was always something I was interested in, not necessarily German in particular, but just generally. I was always just fascinated by anyone who could speak a different language because that was really such a rarity for me when I was growing up. So long story short, I decided that I wanted to take German. I don't know, I probably had a band that I really liked from Germany. And I actually had to take that through community college courses, even when I was still in high school. So I was driving 45 minutes. I come from a very small town, as I said, driving 45 minutes twice a week to go to the local community college and take these courses. So actually, my very first experience and exposure to learning a second language or learning a foreign language has really exclusively been in a university foreign language classroom with a textbook, the whole shebang there. So I was doing that. When I went into university, I decided I wanted to add Russian. So I was actually a Russian and German double major in the university, as well as an English minor. So language generally has just always been a huge fascination for me. I started studying Japanese as well when I was in undergrad. My Japanese is terrible. But I mean, it really was like an addiction. Like I just wanted to keep adding languages and learning more about just all the different ways you can communicate and that people in the world communicate. So when I finished my undergrad, I sort of floated around, wasn't really sure what to do, but I knew that language was interesting to me. And that's actually when I got my first teaching job, which was with a company called Project Worthmore in Denver, Colorado. And they're actually a refugee resettling nonprofit. And they were doing a lot of work helping some recently arrived refugees sort of get settled in the Denver area. And part of their offering was English classes. And I was able to just sort of get started in this classroom actually teaching English, which was a really incredible experience on a lot of levels, but especially I think pedagogically interesting because something, we talk a lot about the communicative language classroom, and there's always that tension, I think, within university classrooms nowadays about communicating in the target language, but there's always the sense of, well, you don't really have to, right? Like we all have some other secondary shared language. My first teaching experience, that was not an option. The only shared language was the target language, was English. And that really impacted my teaching style in terms of phrasing, the way I present things, use of visualizations, use of gesture. And that's all kind of what I brought with me when I then finally decided to really dig in deeper into German language and culture and history, and then actually start up in the German classroom as a graduate student at Columbia. So, yeah.
So I wanted to ask you about a project that you worked on that I found very fascinating with another graduate student. And the title of this project, which was presented as a paper, is Breathing Through Both Nostrils, How to introduce Yiddish in the German classroom.
Hmm.
So, can you talk both about that project and your own thinking that led you to be part of that project?
Hmm. Yeah, so I'll start from the beginning because I think it's relevant. So just to give a little just institutional overview with Columbia, I'm not in a German department. I'm in the Germanic languages department. So there's right from the get-go the sort of implication that it's not just German here, but actually many different Germanic languages. And there's, of course, Dutch. Finnish is taught in the department, although Finnish is not a Germanic language, but, culturally related, I suppose. And this, of course, also includes Yiddish. They have historically accepted graduate students for the Yiddish Ph.D. So not German, but actually in particular Yiddish. And I share an office with someone who's in this program because we're technically in the same department, but we're in two different programs. And those programs have historically been kept very separate. In the department right now, we view this very much as a problem. It's not ideal and there's really no good reason to keep them so separated. So we're currently doing, I think, really good moves to bring these two programs and these two languages closer together in the department. In the year 2020, which is when this all kind of starts, this was very much not the case. So Noah and I only knew each other.
And who is Noah?
So yeah, I should explain. So Noah Tsaoshu is the my fellow graduate student with whom I worked on this project, and who I really want to emphasize her role. She really has contributed quite a bit to this, and so she deserves many accolades for her work on this. So picture this: it's 2020. We are all suddenly teaching online. So she and I, again, have always shared this office, had some nice conversations as colleagues, but never really had many more interactions than that. Suddenly, we are both teaching from the office, kind of stepping on each other's toes a little bit, and we're listening to each other teach. And in order for this to have happened, a few things have to be made clear. The first being that because I'm not European. I'm not a native German speaker. I am a hick from California. I really didn't know much about Yiddish. I really had no strong conception of it. I knew that it was a language. I knew it was strongly related to Jewish identity, but I didn't really know anything about it. And of course, Yiddish is also written in the Hebrew alphabet. So when I see it, I think there's something I don't understand. And that's kind of the end of my thought process. So we're sitting there listening to each other teach. And I'm from my perspective, I'm listening to Noah teach Yiddish. And I'm like, I understand all of this.
Yeah.
And this was, again, maybe very, very already known, very self-explanatory to some people, but this was really a shock to me. I hadn't realized just how close the affinity was. And so we start talking and we started to get into these situations where we could even share teaching materials to a certain extent. Like she was wondering, I wonder how I should handle teaching this grammar. And I said, well, okay, it's the same in German. I do it like this and vice versa. And it really turned into this interesting and fun exchange where we just kept discovering each other's languages in this really fun way and just started constantly having these conversations about comparisons and like, okay, how do you negate this? Oh, you do it like that. I do it like this. And it was just really fun. And for me, because I'm always looking at like, how can I do more in the classroom? How can I make the experience of being in a university level foreign language classroom a little more interesting, a little more intellectually stimulating, and give students something that they can really take with them and hold on to beyond just like, okay, I remember how to say, where's the bathroom, right? So I started thinking like, well, why not, Noah, come to my classroom and teach Yiddish? Like, do people, again, a little bit naive on my part. I'm like, do people know about this? Like,
yeah, right. Yeah.
But I was just really so excited about it. And so we really started thinking about this. And then Noah at the time was a lead teaching fellow actually at the Center for Teaching and Learning here, which gave her the opportunity to conduct some workshops. And so she used that opportunity to develop these workshops to sort of reach out to other graduate students and try to think in a bigger way, what would this mean to teach Yiddish in the German classroom? Like what actually could happen? What are the theoretical stakes? What might the problems be? So she gave two really amazing workshops throughout that year. And we looked not just at, okay, what for the broader university environment. And for other Germanic languages graduate students, like, what is Yiddish? What does it sound like? What is its history? What is, et cetera? What is the geographical spread? What are its cultural ties? So we covered all of that. And then the second workshop, we wanted to pull back a little bit and start thinking about, what does it mean to teach these sort of minor languages that are nevertheless like deeply related to, again, so-called major languages that do end up with their own university courses, right? And I mean, Yiddish and German is one pairing. It's really easy to think of others. It could be really interesting to bring these other languages into the classroom. So that was her second workshop. I have some more thoughts that I have some bigger things to sort of say about that we can get to. But so that was her 2 workshops. And from there, we wanted to put it into action. So I had a day in my syllabus where I thought, you know what, I have space. I was teaching the intermediate level German at the time, specifically the spring semester, so intermediate 2. Mm-hmm. So I had a group of students who were familiar with German. Our course was a lot of free conversation. It was incredibly content focused. We didn't do a huge amount of specific grammar work by that point. So we were talking a lot about 20th century German history. And I realized that I had a day where I could bring Noah in as a guest, and it would just be really interesting to see sort of like what happens, right?
What the students do. It's a fascinating experiment, and I'm curious to know, what did your students say? How did they react when you said, okay, we're gonna do a lesson in Yiddish?
Yeah.
What was their take on that?
So I will say, I'll preface this by saying my one regret about doing this was that I did not actually do some kind of formal like exit ticket for them, which I really wish I had done. So I do have their feedback, and I have, for lack of a better word, their vibes.
Okay.
But I don't actually have any like really explicit formalized written feedback from them. But I can talk a little bit about what the experience was like. So the first thing is, of course, I did ask them to prepare a little bit, and that really consisted just of thinking about their own language competencies. So we have, of course, so many students who do not have English as their native language, who have maybe even multiple languages as their native languages, or who have really strong experiences like having learned a foreign language to a high degree of competency, and they come into the classroom very different than students without that previous experience. And so I asked students to sort of just reflect before the class, to think about what are the other languages that they know, what's their experience of learning German, considering that they have these other languages. Like, do they ever make comparisons in their mind? Do they ever notice differences? And then to also think about, well, what do you know about Yiddish in advance? So that was all the preparation we really gave, was just to sort of reflect on language, reflect on their own languages, and maybe this idea of language family trees.
Was that the day before, or was it like
that was roughly like a day or two beforehand?
Okay.
Yeah.
And then Noah comes into the classroom, and what happens?
Yeah. So when Noah came into the classroom, the first thing I did was sort of debrief these questions. And I should also say this conversation was in English. My concern for that moment was I really wanted to be able to think about these questions in depth and not actually worry about, are we communicating in a target language right now, right?
Yeah.
So we did have an interesting discussion. Very few of the students had previous exposure to Yiddish. Those that did had Jewish heritage. And there was one student who I think is an interesting kind of student that we can maybe think about with these issues, who had really wanted to take Yiddish, but was concerned that it wasn't going to be as professionally relevant, as it wasn't going to take them as far as having German, which then, of course, you can get scholarships, you can do this, you can do that. So that's an interesting kind of student to think about with these major minor language pairings. There's students that actually have really deep personal interests in whatever the sort of minor or periphery language is, but are sort of afraid to actually commit to it for whatever reason. So that was interesting. So we had a little debrief conversation. The first thing I did was introduce Noah. And now we're switching into German. So I actually did all of the introduction of her in German. I had her then respond in English saying, just to be clear, I don't speak German,
Okay.
but I understand everything that was just said. So already sort of starting to warm up a little bit with, okay, that's interesting. Here's someone who doesn't speak German, and yet they understood everything that we just
Yeah.
discussed.
And why is that?
Yeah, exactly. So it's just sort of opening up that question. Then we moved into a cognate exercise. So just to like review, right, cognates are words that have a same origin or a shared origin, and so they sound the same usually in across different languages. And Noah had actually found an amazing video that was so perfect as the launching point for this lesson. It was an Orthodox wedding where there's a sort of comedian who's entertaining the wedding guests, and his comedy consists of actually comparing Yiddish and English. So finding these words that have a shared origin. For example, the Yiddish word for right, recht. I'm going to say it very Germanically. I should say in parentheses, I truly apologize to all my amazing Yiddish colleagues for my bad pronunciation. So he's making fun basically of this. Okay, look, Yiddish and English is the same language. It's kind of his whole shtick. Night, Nacht, right, recht. So he's highlighting the Germanic language ties basically. We had the students listen first to this English-Yiddish pairing and then think, okay, what's the German? And for me, this was important because it's easy to forget that English is a Germanic language.
Yeah.
And so we're not just talking about two languages, Yiddish and German, but actually also English. And being able to bring that into the classroom was just as important for me. So that was our sort of warm-up activity, and it was a lot of fun. The video is really funny, and again, it's a real. We're very lucky that we were able to find that because it was such a perfect lead-in, but could be easily modeled, I think, to if we're thinking about how to replicate this between other languages. Starting with cognates is definitely, I think, just the simplest way to start to think about, like, look, it's the same. So from there, Noah also found, again, another just absolutely incredible quote. We wanted to start thinking about historical influences on language. So again, now we're sort of switched back into English in terms of the classroom discussion. And she brought in this incredible quote that's also, again, kind of a joke. And I'll read the quote if that's all right.
Sure, yeah.
It says, "You surely remember the anecdote of the Jewish lady who was in labor. Her first groan was in the French, mon Dieu, and then the second in Russian, Bоже mой. But when the doctor heard Gott in Himmel, he knew that the real throes had begun." It's a fantastic anecdote and says so much with so little. This idea that we're dealing with a language that's sort of at the core of something and otherwise like encased in these other languages, which says so much about what does it mean to be the language of a diaspora, of a people that have been frequently forced to move, that are sort of in between, like assimilating a sort of dominant culture and resisting it.
Just to make sure I've understood, in this anecdote, the outer language is French,
right,
and then the sort of go one layer in, and that's Russian,
right,
and then all the way at the core is Yiddish.
Then we have the Yiddish,
Okay, yeah,
which is paralleling some historical movement, moving from France more into Eastern Europe, and along the way, there's just so much influence and exchange that happens. And again, like the cognates, a really great starting off point to get students to just start to think about language and culture and history in a way that we actually rarely ask them to do in the language classroom, because there's so much more of a concern about the student's ability to produce a language, to be understood, to sort of function in it. And at least in my experience, I rarely was ever asked in other university classrooms to start to think linguistically or to think like historically about what is this language? Why does it look like this? Why is it shaped like this?
Yeah. What did you feel your students took away from this, or what were they starting to think about by participating in this lesson?
They were all incredibly interested, and we did have some really great conversations about like, what does this quote mean? A lot of students being able, for me, it's also really important that students are able to draw on competencies that they bring in from outside of the classroom. And so this was a moment where I had a lot of students we all have these students where they're so smart, like, and they have so much to say and they have so many big interests, but like it's hard for them to get the language out. Like it's something that just isn't been a main focus for them. And you can see that like frustration in their eyes.
Yeah.
And this was a moment where I felt like I had a number of students who are in that position just really like come alive. And just suddenly it's like, because now they're not being restricted, of course, by this needing to speak in German the whole time, but they were having such amazing deep thinking about language, about the history of a language, and about these sort of linguistic ties. So it was really important to me to create space for that kind of thinking. And I would like to say that it worked. We could always go further in it. This was really the first time. So it was all a little experimental, but just to allow the space for something like that to happen, I think it worked out.
So I was wondering if you could talk about the issue of metalinguistic skills or competencies, not just learning the content of one language, but the skill or the foundation of knowledge that you gain when you learn a language. How do you view that?
Right. I think I can start also a little anecdotally about one of the first things that I noticed when I started teaching at Columbia was right off the bat that when you're teaching an elementary language, or like the very first sequence of a language, the presumption is that, okay, you're in this class because you don't know a word of German, you've never studied it before, so everyone here is a beginner, with air quotes strongly around this idea that, okay, you're all at the same level, essentially. We're all starting from zero. But you quickly learn that this is not the case at all. We have students who have already learned many other languages, secondary languages, who are, for lack of a better word, like they're pros. They're pros at language learning. They're very used to the language classroom. They know what to expect. When on day one, when I walk in and I start blabbing German at them in the communicative way of trial by fire, I can't think of a better term.
Yeah.
That sort of shock exposure that we all do on the first day of the classroom. Those are students that take this in calmly. They understand what's being expected of them immediately, and they can sort of start to process, okay, what am I learning? What am I hearing? And then you have the other students who are just terrified. They're just looking at you wide-eyed. They don't understand what's going on. They don't understand what's expected of them. They've never done this before. And this is, at least my anecdotal experience, this is a very American problem to run into. In other places, I don't think you would meet a young adult who has truly never been asked to study another language before. And it's really, really important to me that we, first of all, acknowledge these huge differences. That, yeah, okay, we're all beginners at German, but we're not all beginners at language learning. And by not making that explicit, you're really doing a disservice to these students who need this sort of meta skill set before they can even really get started. They need to understand that they should be listening for things. They need to understand that they should be mimicking things. It's not actually self-explanatory for someone who's never done this before. And so that's where my concern really started, was just being in the classroom and noticing right off the bat that I actually have two very different student bodies that I'm dealing with, and they need very different things from me. How can I do this?
Yeah, I remember when I first started studying Italian at the university, I'd not learned another language before.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And so that first day, that first week, there were people who were really just off to the races. Maybe they knew Spanish, or maybe they learned another language, and I was like stunned. And I felt so bad about myself. I'm like, why can't I do this? And
Right.
if I'd had a teacher that said, if this is your first time learning a language, you're on a different path.
Yeah.
It's a different, learning a language in and of itself is a skill that if you're doing it for the first time, you're really starting on the ground level.
Right. Yeah, and that's exactly my point. And I think that this should be something that's like at the level of the syllabus. Like we really need to find a way to be more explicit about developing language techniques that acknowledge this difference in the classroom, because it's particular to the sort of classroom language learning experience. So kind of from that, I became really interested in how can we make these skills where the impact of the skill and experience is so visible in the classroom, but it's not actually like named because we're only ever talking at the level of the content of the language. It's not about how well do you understand language. It's always about how is your German or how is your Italian. For me, this is not the right approach. I think that the university classroom is an opportunity to talk more deeply about language and language structure, and also to think about our own native languages and the way that we grapple with all these different words and sounds inside of us. This is an opportunity to actually be explicit about linguistics, about like the history of a language and its development. And I don't see why not, right? Like why can't this be put in the classroom? Why can't we talk about English in the German class? Like, why not? Like, because it's going to come up anyways.
Sure.
If I can't explain the accusative case in German if you don't even know what the differences between a subject and object is in English. And this happens, it's just speaking with my fellow graduate students or my federal graduate colleagues that are also teaching. I mean, the first weeks of an elementary 1 class, your office hours are occupied by exactly these students where you're actually not teaching them German at all first. You're teaching them, okay, let's just look at this English sentence. What's the subject? What's the object? What does it mean to conjugate a verb? I mean, it really is not knowledge that they have, but it's also essentially a prerequisite that's not named for these courses.
And if you think about it, some students go to a kind of classical lyceum where they're learning the grammar of Latin. Other students are coming from different backgrounds and they don't have that kind of thing. And so there's a kind of hidden tax almost on students who don't have that kind of, you might say, elite background that gives them all of that metalinguistic information.
Yeah. And I see no problem with organizing a syllabus for that student body. That's not going to harm the students who do come in with this background. And in fact, for me, also part of my pedagogy is in the language classroom. There's so many opportunities for this. I want to invite my students to be teachers. And so often what I do as well when I'm teaching is, if let's say there's a grammar topic, like, okay, what is a subject? What is an object? There is going to be a student in the room who knows. It's really fun and nice to actually invite those students to explain it and to create an environment where this isn't about, oh, they know and you don't know and we have to be secretive about it or you have to like work on this. Because guess what? A lot of these students also might have other native languages than English, but that they also didn't necessarily study grammatically. So they do actually have maybe a whole other world of language, but that they just don't have these sort of grammatical terms. And that's also really interesting to invite them to share when that comes up in the classroom. And actually to go back to the Yiddish lesson, one thing that I loved that happened just spontaneously, we had a student who had some Arabic background. And there was a moment where he sort of perked up and he's like, wait a minute, I know this. And I'm not going to repeat exactly what it said because I can't remember and I don't want to say the wrong thing. But there was an aspect of greeting that he was familiar with from Arabic. You know, Noah and I had not even discussed this. It hadn't come up in our sort of very Eurocentric intro to Yiddish. Like, we did not bring up necessarily Arabic ties at all. But he brought up this, like, wait a minute, I know this word. This is like what I say. And it was such an amazing moment. And that student, like, that just here's a spontaneous tie. Like, that's so interesting. Why is this? Like, let's talk about it. Where did that come from? So these moments of finding familiarity are so exciting for students and really validating for the knowledge that they bring into the classroom. So I'm bringing that up for students that maybe have a stronger grammatical background because of the education that they were able to have, allowing them to sort of actually take over sometimes and let them do some explaining can be fabulous. And then also conversely, students that have all sorts of amazing language competencies, not necessarily developed in a classroom, to be able to share some of those experiences in a spontaneous way and not worry about, well, does it have to do with German? I don't care. I want to know about language. I want to know where the ties are happening that you see. Again, it's just ways to keep students engaged, to sort of keep the stakes a little bit higher then I'm learning to fit into a particular culture. We're all navigating multilingual worlds. Language is so tied to identity and background, and I don't want any student to feel like they need to hide their experience with language, because that is so crucial to like how you identify and how you see yourself and your background. And I just think it's all interesting. So I just want to see it in the classroom.
So if I can kind of summarize
Sure.
some of the, I guess, bigger lessons that I'm drawing from this project, which I actually first heard about 8 months ago when you presented at a conference in New York City. I think one of the lessons is this theme we were talking about earlier, the relationship between politics, culture, history, and language. And so putting these two distinct or conceivably distinct languages, German and Yiddish, into dialogue with each other, you start to ask questions about why is German the way that it is? Why is it the way that it is grammatically and lexically, but also institutionally? And why is Yiddish the way that it is grammatically, lexically, and also institutionally? So that's kind of the sort of inner set of considerations. And then the broader outer set of considerations, which expands outwards, is the idea of what you were saying about metalinguistic knowledge. When you compare two languages and you understand connections between them, and then maybe you add a third language like Arabic and understand some connections there, you understand that language learning itself is its own set of skills, and you can transfer that between different languages. So if you learn the grammar of German, and maybe you have a home language that's a language you've not learned the grammar of, but you have understanding of, you can transfer back that grammatical knowledge into the language that you already know.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a great summary. When we encounter these different languages, they're not the way that institutionally they get set up and the way they get taught they feel very, for me at least, it feels very much boxed in, where we've created the box. Here's all the German things. We put them all in this box, and we're not concerned with anything outside of this German box. This is not how we actually like live and work in multiple languages. The languages are always running up against each other within us, but also in the world. And I would love to see university classrooms that allow themselves to just sort of like let the box open up. Let's just let it. We're here to talk about language, and that can be on so many different levels. And for me, introducing a learning goal, maybe at like a semester long, like a syllabus level learning goal, into these courses that makes explicit this idea of we are learning to think about language on multiple levels. We're learning to think about what it means to move between different languages. But if we actually make explicit the metalinguistic skills the students are gaining, this is the stuff they're not going to forget, right? They're not going to forget how to look at language differently, right? They're not going to forget what they learn about their own native language in the context of the course. They're not going to forget what it means to deal with a translation issue, even if they don't remember the particular words. Like, they'll have so much more sympathy for later in life. Okay, I'm working with someone. Our native languages are not the same. I understand what's happening, right? Like that awareness is not going to disappear. This is really a skill set that students do take with them and will not lose, and that has meaningful impacts on the rest of their lives. So, yeah.
Well, Skye Shannon Savage, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank
I really
you.
appreciated it.
Thank you.